This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends.
And when people are afraid, they're much easier to control. And they're all led to believe that Donald Trump is this sort of magical person who God anointed to carry out his will. And, you know, the other side is demonic and satanic. They use like terms like demonic and satanic frequently. And therefore, we've got to put our faith in him. And, you know, he's fighting for us. So, you know, that kind of conspiracies, we could say, well, it's a mega church, draws a few thousand people, doesn't matter. It really does matter because all those YouTubers and all those, you know, bloggers and influencers are putting their stuff out there into the far right disinformation sphere. And that is trickling into churches. It's trickling into right-wing spaces. And even some of it is designed to trickle into left-wing spaces, like through this sort of Maha movement where you get this sort of yoga mamas who are, you know, into natural childbirth and, you know, anti-vax, et cetera. And then all of a sudden they're being red pilled.
My guest today is Katherine Stewart. She is a journalist and author. Her most recent book is Money, Lies, and God: Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Katherine, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here. Blake, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. The last time we talked on the air, I think was maybe over 5 years ago. But so much has happened since then. We're well into Trump 2.0. We're recording this in February 2026, but your book, when I read it, I did get an advance copy, so I started reading it at the tail end of 2024. Your book came out at the beginning of 2025. There's so much incredible reporting in there, and it still helps us speak to and understand this moment, and that's what I really want to highlight. And where I want to start with your book is one of the things you provide is a number of categories or groups of people within these anti-democratic movements. And we're just going to launch right into it because I know you've got a tight schedule today. But those 5 groups are funders, thinkers, sergeants, infantry, and power players. Can you break those down for us and who are some representatives within those various groups?
Sure. Thanks, Blake. You know, I've been following this movement for 17 years. And as I was putting Money, Lies, and God together, I really wanted to think of a taxonomy of the movement as I sort of observed it and seen it evolve over time. So to start, I pay very close attention to the money people, a group I call the funders. They are the beneficiaries of the massive concentrations of wealth at the very tippy top of the economic ladder over the past 5 decades. And listen, America has a lot of very wealthy people. They're not all funding this movement. But within that sort of subset of ultra wealthy, there is a sector that is investing much of their fortunes in these anti-democratic projects. I'm thinking about people like the Corkerys or Barry Side or the Wilkes brothers, Tim Dunn, members of the Prince DeVos family. Here's the thing about these folks. They're not any one type. Religiously, frankly, they're all over the place. And some of them aren't even that religious at all. But what they really agree on is the need to crush liberalism and what they call the administrative state, which really is the functions of an effective democratic government. They want economic policies that benefit their enormous concentrations of wealth that will make them even wealthier than they are. They want low taxes for the rich, protection of tax evasion strategies, and they also want protective policies for their monopolistic businesses. So they might call themselves pro-capitalist people, but they want those protective policies which actually squelch competition. So they're drawn to ideologies that tell them that they earned every single penny they have with their bare hands and they deserve it. They don't have an obligation to help anyone else in society. They have a right to rule and others have a duty to obey. So that's the funders, right? Now, on the other pole, right, we have a group I call the foot soldiers, the rank and file voters. And Christian nationalism is arguably the single most important piece of the anti-democratic reaction broadly because it motivates a lot of those foot soldiers, a lot of those rank and file voters. a lot of them might not themselves identify as Christian nationalists. They might not say, like, I'm a Christian nationalist, but with their actions, with their votes, they're actually lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda.
Right.
They're sort of not themselves. It's like you can think of Christian nationalism as like fascism, right? Not everyone who contributes to bring that about is a quote unquote fascist, but it's like a dynamic that affects political systems, not necessarily a full-fledged agenda. Right. And so then, there are these other categories, a cadre of leaders, political pastors, national activists. I call these cohorts the sergeants and power players, and they're the ones who are often driving the agenda. So, for example, you look at people leading organizations like Ralph Reed or Tony Perkins, or someone like Leonard Leo, who has served as a money man for the religious and has played an outsized role in sort of shaping the courts. Those are the sort of, I would say, called power players. And then sergeants are the very political pastors who have, joined together to turn out their congregants to vote for a sort of pro-MAGA entity. And then I also, finally, the last categories of thinkers. Many of these intellectuals, or as I sometimes think of them, pseudo-intellectuals, are affiliated with a movement called the New Right. And technically, they're not quite what you would call Christian nationalist. Some seem really nihilistic. A few of them identify as Christian nationalists, many don't. And some take on a kind of Christian nationalist identity, I think, for strategic purposes rather than because they're true believers. And, they're criticizing what they call liberal elites, but they themselves really want to become a new elite.
Have any of those groups changed substantially since Trump was elected and since this administration has begun? This particular administration does feel less turbulent in some ways because there's less personnel turnover. But have you seen any substantive changes since you published this book about the people within those various groups?
Yes. I mean, to give one example, I think the infusion of tech money has changed the thinkers. Mm-hmm. They are ascendant in the anti-democratic movement. Now, that doesn't mean that the religious right leaders are unimportant. I mean, they certainly are important. But broadly speaking, we have a lot of tech and corporate money now behind the thinkers, behind the new right. Mm-hmm. And I think as a consequence, some of the religious right leaders, they're not the only power players. It's not that they don't matter anymore. I mean, Christian nationalist leadership is, again, really important for keeping a segment of the American population disinformed and in line, but the thinkers are riding high on their newfound power. So I think that's one change that we've seen over time.
Are those figures like Curtis Yarvin or even people like Peter Thiel, like those types of figures are more ascendant at this moment?
Absolutely. That whole world, that whole new right world is really ascendant. I have 3 chapters about the new right in Money, Lies, and God. And I would also direct viewers to look at Laura Field's book, which she just published a book about the new right. It's really fantastic. She's kind of been in that world for quite some time and has very carefully documented its rise and its sort of power structures.
Yeah. Okay, great. I will add that book to the show notes for people to check out. You also talk about these mindsets or dispositions that are susceptible to. Maybe it would be one way to say it with regard to people that are receptive to this Christian nationalist, authoritarian, fascist, however you want, whatever sort of synonyms you want for anti-democratic movements. You talk about a number of different elements of that. I believe there are 4: catastrophism, persecution complex, identitarianism, and authoritarianism. And I'm curious about how you understand those terms and how they work together. And the supplemental question for 2026 is, do they function as well when authoritarianism is sort of on full display at a height of its power, and what we're seeing happening in Minneapolis and other places here in the United States through things like ICE that we're seeing in the U.S. right now?
Thanks for the question. These 4 dispositions work together. So first, this identitarianism, the idea that you're with us, you're against us, you're one of the pure versus the impure. It's a way of dividing the population between a kind of insider versus outsider, right? A second is the persecution complex. The more at risk, no group that is more at risk of annihilation than white conservative Christians. And they feel they're entitled to rule because they represent the so-called real America, the authentic America, the founders' America. The third is this idea of catastrophism. The world is going to hell in a handbasket. We're on the edge of an apocalypse, thanks to the woke liberals, feminists, et cetera, et cetera. Drastic measures are absolutely necessary in order to save us from, this terrible fate. And this clears the way for the push for a strong man, someone who's going to break the rules because the rules are broken, they say, by the sort of other, right? And only a tough guy can save us. They want someone who's going to crack heads as long as those heads belong to their political enemies. So those messages, those sort of mindsets help make up the dynamic of Christian nationalism. And here's the thing, it doesn't actually have that much to do with religion apart from a kind of identitarian marker. And that's what's so much of what's driving the MAGA movement today. But I want to talk a little more specifically about the persecution complex because of how important it is to this movement. So this is a movement that's always promoting the idea that conservative Christians are the most discriminated against people in American society. This belief has no basis, or this assertion, I should say, has no basis whatsoever. FBI studies, for instance, have shown over and over that Christians, particularly white Christians, are far, far less than any other group to experience discrimination or be targeted for violence, right? But these are key talking points that most of the right-wing information sphere is promoting at this point. These talking points show up in Donald Trump's speeches, in the speeches of his boosters and surrogates and allied politicians. This kind of idea shows up on Newsmax and Fox News and right-wing radio. This idea shows up in the pulpits of American conservative churches, right? And Christian nationalist churches. So it turns out you don't have to persecute people in order to make them feel persecuted. All you have to do is repeat over and over, telling them that their values are being maltreated and they are disrespected, and they eventually believe it. And basically, the tactical effect of these kinds of messages is a means of clearing the way for authoritarian leadership because, the MAGA movement claims to represent the people, and they say, you're being disrespected, you need us to fight for you. In the meantime, some of the richest men in the world are funding operations that are actually getting economic policies to increase their wealth and decrease the wealth of the rank and file of the MAGA movement. So, they claim that they're driving support, and they claim to stand for the American family, but they're driving support for politicians whose economic policies are making it so much harder for American families.
I want to talk a little bit about elites and sort of the role that the elite ruling class has in this whole movement. We've already talked about that in some regard, but one of the things that really stuck out to me in your book is that you point out the degree to which all of the people that are the thinkers and some of the funders are elites and have had placements and positions and studied at elite institutions. So Ron DeSantis went to Harvard and Yale. Curtis Yarvin was at Johns Hopkins and Brown and UC Berkeley. Josh Hawley was from Stanford and Harvard. Vivek Ramaswamy was at Yale. Like, down the line, these people went to elite institutions, but then they play yokels on TV, or they...
Oh, and have worked for hedge funders. I mean, think about Peter Thiel, who basically, has been a key figure in supporting Vance and so many others in this movement. I mean, they are an elite themselves, and they want to be dominant. It's like an intra-elite struggle.
Right. Yeah. And that was your turn of phrase, and I'm gonna quote a couple of lines. You say, when they talk about sticking it to the administrative state or fantasize about having their dictator buddy manhandle the libs, they seem to be dreaming about revenge on the people down the hall. They're going to show those professors, administrators, girls who wouldn't date them, and fellow students who were mean to them on their way up who's who. And is it really that petty? Is it really they're so committed to their own power, their own "I'll show you," to the detriment of all others, to the detriment of the decay and decline of the administrative state and of the stability of Western democracies?
Well, I think we can't overlook the role, like the fact that these folks exist in a bubble, right? They're repeating the same messages to one another. And I think they often believe it. They do. Some of them have come to believe that, some people have a right to rule. They do. Their funders do. And the functions of democracy are no longer working. Some of them have made it very explicit with books that assert that democracy won't give them the kind of power that they want and that they think that they need. And therefore, they'll just destroy democracy in order to create a kind of new oligarchy of like a Red Caesar, right? A kind of, and his allies. We can't overlook the role of money here. I mean, they've come close enough to this kind of enormous sources of wealth to feel its power and its seductiveness. Mm-hmm. So they've thrown their lot in with that sector of the billionaires who support this. They know they can sort of shore up their careers if they sort of mouth the right ideological talking points. And in doing so, they've thrown their lot in with Trump. And they've seen a huge payoff for themselves.
Yeah. And you mentioned bubbles, information bubbles, and that is something that we all sort of reckon with or have to deal with in our own sort of information diet or media diet, as some people call it.
As in your own families.
Yeah. And there are a lot of these people are architects and overseers of major digital networks and information ecosystems. Are there any sort of, and I am using this turn of phrase of like anti-democratic and pro-democratic. Are there any sort of pro-democracy networks that rival what we see at work? And whether it's something like, the very clear conservative takeover of Twitter, now X, that sort of thing. Is there anything that rivals what we see on the right, just on the other side of the equation?
Well, there are a lot. There's a lot of progressive, liberal, and moderate money in America. And some of it is funding organizations that I would call sort of pro-democracy organizations. There's a enormous pushback in the legal community against some of the unconstitutional actions of the Trump administration. The lower courts, including courts dominated by right-wing appointees, are pushing back to some degree. There is legitimate media in America, but we all know about Fox News and how much of our media has been turned into kind of propaganda sphere, and there's a whole world of media off to the far right of Fox News. When I was writing Money, Lies, and God, I attended a few gatherings of Reawaken America. You know what that is, right? But for those who don't, it's a gathering that takes sort of Trumpy gathering that takes place in mega churches around the country in the run up to the 2024 election. It was taking place every couple of weeks. Thousands of people would be drawn to these mega churches, including a ton of YouTubers and people, social media influencers on the far right. And they would echo every conspiracy imaginable. They're trying to replace real Americans with others, with illegals or whatever. They want to control every dollar you own. They're trying to microchip you and change your gender against your will. All of this nonsense, right? You go into those spaces and it's just like sort of far right madness, conspiracy fest. But the biggest, and JFK is still alive. I mean, I saw that. Roger Stone did nothing wrong. Like, there's a lot of signs about that, like people wearing T-shirts, a lot of sort of Christian nationalist signs or messaging on the T-shirts, et cetera. The very interesting thing is that I don't think everybody who attends those gatherings believes in every single conspiracy. But what I can see is that they exist to confuse people, to make them afraid. And when people are afraid, they're much easier to control. And they're all led to believe that Donald Trump is this sort of magical person who God anointed to carry out his will. And, the other side is demonic and satanic. They use terms like demonic and satanic frequently. And therefore, we've got to put our faith in him. And, he's fighting for us. So, that kind of conspiracies, we could say, well, it's a mega church, draws a few thousand people, doesn't matter. It really does matter, because all those YouTubers and all those, bloggers and influencers are putting their stuff out there into the far right disinformation sphere. And that is trickling into churches. It's trickling into right-wing spaces. And even some of it is designed to trickle into left-wing spaces, like through this sort of Maha movement, where you get this sort of yoga mamas who are, into natural childbirth and, anti-vax, et cetera. And then all of a sudden they're being red pilled. So, yeah, that sort of far right disinformation sphere has really been incredibly impactful. And the movement is very deliberate about that. They know that if you can separate people from the facts, it makes them easier to control. And that goes, Blake, back to what you said about some of these billionaires acquiring really important media platforms. We're just a couple of days ago, I think, with Jeff Bezos fired hundreds of people from the Washington Post. He acquired that asset, destroyed the op-ed page, turned it into sort of far right mouthpiece in a way. And now he's sort of destroying the newsroom capabilities. Think about the Ellisons, who acquired CBS amongst their other media properties and now have degraded that media property significantly, and they're suffering in terms of their ratings. Think about Elon Musk, who acquired Twitter in order to degrade it. So I think that that's deliberate, that kind of acquiring something like it's your plaything and then kind of destroying it, because what you're doing is you're destroying fact-based media, you're destroying fact-checkable information, you're destroying a kind of a commons, right? And we've seen this in so many features of our democracy. Unfortunately, if the far right wants to decimate the things that hold us together as a country and as a democracy.
We're seeing figures like Nick Shirley, who was this 23-year-old YouTuber, whatever, alt-right influencer, make some outlandish claims about Somalian, about Somalians in Minnesota running daycare centers and alleging.
Well, there was, let's be clear, there was a really terrible scam that was being run, and a huge amount of public money was basically stolen. I want to point out that similar scams have happened in Texas, in Arizona. We're not seeing the same ICE response in those areas. If you want to look for a scam, by the way, let's just go look at the White House, where we've seen unprecedented levels of corruption and graft. Our president has turned the White House into his ATM, basically. He and his family have enriched themselves to the tune of billions of dollars. He's basically selling off our country for cash for himself and his buddies. And so if they're looking for,
and even something like the Trump phone, supposedly it was going to go into the mobile carrier game, Ryan Reynolds and the smartless group.
Nonsense. Yeah, just look at the charter industry. There are so many, there are publications like the Orlando Sentinel, or there's a publication in Detroit, I think the Detroit Free Press and others, that have documented very carefully these charter network scandals, often run by people with a sort of more right-wing or religious sort of ideological orientation. So scams are terrible wherever they happen, whether they're happening in Minnesota or Arizona or in Washington, D.C. and the White House, and we should hold their perpetrators to account. But to use this as an example to target people who are often in this country under sort of some kind of legal basis for abuse, warehousing them in gulags where somebody is making money for every single day that body is in that place. They don't have access to lawyers or clean food or clean water, et cetera. That is a disgrace.
Right. And my reason for bringing up Nick Shirley is like this. He did cover something that may have, that, as you said, may have been grounded in facts, but he sensationalized it, and then that drove the Trump administration to respond with an outsized response that has led to well documented deaths, to all of these other things. Even the case of Liam Ramos, whose family who went through the proper channels to receive the status that they had, and still is being targeted for deportation. And
I mean, if
my
people
question.
are criminals, great. Like, go after them if they're involved in that, kind of graft or
Right.
abuse of government resources, great. But like that extends to people at the highest levels of
Absolutely.
government.
And my what I am curious about is, do you think this is a turn, and that like now like, and I do remember at the beginning of the year, uh, some of the footage of like the Situation Room or the War Room, where Hexeth and others were monitoring what was happening in Venezuela. They had X up in the background because they're playing to their crowds. And I've seen some people say like this is like our government is being run by influencers now. Like these people are just, they're doing it for the online clout, which is the silly. But do you see evidence of that in your lens, and how that now these groups fought for so long and strived to capture the conversation, and now they themselves are captured by it?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of people making money off of this
Mm,
stuff. We also have to kind of understand the mindset um, for those who are still fully on board with his agenda. I think the ICE raids, in the view of many MAGA supporters, are a validation of their worldview, right? Not a challenge to it. They think that righteous Americans are being persecuted in a lawless society. And the fact that ICE has to sort of break down doors and target 5-year-olds, assault random observers, it kind of confirms that view. They think any resistance to ICE whatsoever is interpreted as a kind of liberal kowtowing to illegal immigration and support for
mm,
criminality. And but what I think this points to is the fact that for some, hard right religion is actually has less to do with religion than with a kind of punitive impulse. It's a desire to to punish perceived outsiders or evildoers or transgressors. Some of these folks are explicitly opposed to what they call woke Christianity, or they call it unmanly. It's frankly, this is a kind of social justice oriented Christianity, which is ironically how many, if not most, Americans understand their faith, but they're explicitly against it. They talk about toxic empathy and how too many Christians have fallen under the spell of too much empathy or something like that. And third, we're talking like the rank and file here. So they've been trained to to like scapegoat, others, right, for their problems. It's easier for them to blame immigrants, who are including those who are here on a legal basis, than the sector of reactionary than it is for them to understand how the sector of billionaires is promoting hard right economic policies and funding an anti-democratic movement, which is the real reason for a lot of the grievances that they seem to hold and share.
mm-hmm. I want to bring our conversation towards some more recent developments, which is just for the further release of the Epstein files, and I do think there are certainly many ways to comment on the Epstein files, and how this plays in, but some of the things that were revealed in the most recent tranche of released documents, which were numbered in the millions, was that Epstein himself was involved around the time of the inception of the very influential, politically incorrect, or poll channel on 4chan. Like literally spoke to the admin who ran 4chan at the time, and the day after or the day of, poll was either started or reinstated, and that puts Epstein sort of at the genesis of that particular permutation of what we now know as the new right or the alt-right. Like, how does that change how we account for the sea changes we've seen in politics since poll was established and started sort of spreading its influence?
Well, the reporting is still coming out. I don't know enough about it yet to comment specifically on these files. I hope that this is the launching point for 1,000 fantastic book deals. And I look forward to reading those books. But whatever comes out, I think the big story is what we already know, right? We have an administration and a government that is committed not to finding out the truth about what is the most appalling sexual abuse and pedophilia and corruption ring in recent memory, but they're committed to protecting and defending the perpetrators. That in itself is something really astonishing, but it's already clear. So whatever we find out, we know that we can't trust this administration or this Department of Justice to do anything but hide and perpetrate an absolutely appalling injustice. And the details of this stuff are shocking. The fact that you had people like Acosta and Pam Bondi sort of covering up Acosta from way back. Even Bill Barr, his father was an associate, or I think hired Epstein for one of his first jobs at a school, right? And his involvement does not appear to be completely neutral either, although I don't really know the details, so I don't want to, I'm not making any accusations here. But what we are seeing is this overwhelming drive from this administration and people associated with it to protect these perpetrators. We've seen an alliance with criminals, but it doesn't surprise me, and it shouldn't surprise anyone who's been paying attention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, your book, very thankfully, I think, ends on a forward-looking note, and that's where I want to wrap up this part of the conversation as well. Your book ends with these 6 findings, and if you don't mind, I'll read them out. Yes. The first is we're still in the majority. Second is that they are divided. Third is the separation of church and state is a good idea, and we should try it. I love that stinger because it doesn't seem like we've been trying it for quite a while. Fourth is extreme levels of material inequality are eroding democracy. Fifth is knowledge is power. And the final one is organization matters. And from your perspective at this point in early 2026, I'm curious how your thoughts on how we continue to respond to such a well-coordinated and funded assaults on democracy and the other norms that have just been under constant assault during this second administration for Trump.
Thanks for asking. You know, it's interesting. I'm a journalist and not an activist. There are people who specialize in how to get engaged politically. I mean, there are a lot of folks like that out there, and they have a lot of different ideas. I mean, my job as a journalist is really to document what's happening. But I think I've observed the field long enough to say something about the kinds of goals and strategies people should have if they want to restore American democracy. We need serious reforms. They're going to be required. And we need reforms in terms of our media ecosystem, our approach to the economy, the legitimacy and integrity of the courts, and the functioning of Congress. We need, in a sense, a kind of new reconstruction. I will say, I feel comfortable talking about the importance of voting. I think that, I remember Ralph Reed, one of the movement's very seasoned strategists, saying at, in the run-up to 2016, he said, pay no attention to the polls, our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he's absolutely right about that. Yes, there's been what Ralph Reed called a Republican reapportionment advantage, which is a nicer way to put like race-based gerrymandering and voter suppression tactics. And he sort of was so happy about like, if they're up 1% to 4%, we win. If they're up 5% to 7%, it's a jump ball. If they're up 8 points or more, they win. So you can see that the field is tilted. On the other hand, there are more of us than them. There are more Americans who would prefer to live in a functioning democracy with all of its quirks and imperfections than want to live in some kind of oligarchic, plutocratic run autocracy with theocratic features. So I think the best hope of a sort of idea of equal rights and justice for all is in our democracy, as sort of quirky as it may be. And, now is not the time to sit on your hands. Now is the time to get out there. I mean, there are things we can do as individuals and things we can do better when we join together with others, supporting pro-democracy organizations, voting not just in national elections, but in local elections as well, where a lot of folks don't vote, paying attention to what's happening locally, as the folks in Minneapolis did, because a lot of this stuff filters down to the local level. So pay attention to what's happening in your school district, in your town hall, like that kind of stuff is really important. And above all, like just, I think at this time where a lot of folks feel overwhelmed, form community, take care of yourself, take care of one another, because that's really what a democracy is supposed to do.
Wonderful. Well, the most recent book is Money Lies in God, right here, also directly over Katherine's shoulder there. Katherine, thank you so much for joining me today and talking about your book and about what's going on here in 2026.
Thank you so much. It's really great to chat with you.
Hey, thanks for watching this episode of The Good Books, where I talk to authors about books that go beyond the most recent releases and headlines and help us understand the world and our place in it. I really hope that you enjoyed this interview and that you be sure to, do all the YouTube and podcast things. Subscribe on YouTube, rate and review it over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all those things. You can also follow everything that I'm doing over at blakechastain.com. And we'll see you in the next one.